Thank you, everybody, for your time this morning. I'm always grateful when people come out early in the morning to hear about public policy, because sometimes it's not the most exciting. I remember when I started at the Show Me Institute, talking to my colleague David Stokes, trying to have him explain TIF to me, and I remember saying to him, look, I know it's bad, I just need you to tell me exactly what it is. And the exciting part for me is that people around Missouri are starting to understand this policy. I think because they get in their gut that developers, investors have a special line to politicians to get favors, and TIF is a more and more common example of how kind of the well-connected and the well-heeled take advantage of politicians at the local level. So first, let me just make the point that tax increment financing, which I'll explain in a bit, but that it is a big deal. The organization Good Jobs First, which is a left-leaning organization, has talked about Missouri having almost 4,000 development subsidies worth over a total of $5 billion. That's $1,000 per person in Missouri. We're ranked 10th in total tax dollars. That puts us ahead of Illinois and California and Florida. There are approximately 474 active TIF projects in Missouri worth just over $2.5 billion. The top recipients are names you might recognize. Cerner, H&R Block, and DST Systems are all located in Kansas City, where I live, and Kansas City is a particularly fond user of this economic development tool. And what is it exactly? TIF, when people explain it, seems like it's a great idea. The point was to use a government policy to encourage development in urban areas that hadn't seen a lot of economic development, and to say to those developers, look, if you guys will introduce economic activity into this part of town, we will help lessen the risk of the investment by diverting back to you some of the additional taxes, property taxes you'll pay. And of course, as you'll hear later, a lot of times, or all the time, those property taxes would have gone to schools, libraries, mental health fund, city and county services, but they now go back to the developer to help defray the cost of the development. Interesting, California was the first state to adopt TIF in 1952. And in 2000, it says 52, I think it was 62. But in 2004, pretty much all 50 states had used it. California ended the program in 2012 because it had become so costly to the state. So again, we talked about the increment. So you buy a piece of land and you pay an amount of property tax based on the assessment. And you might go to the city and say, I want to develop this, which will result in a higher tax increment, but I'd like you to give a portion of that, a large portion of that, back to me for a period of up to 23 years. Oftentimes it is 100% of the property taxes that go to libraries and cities, but only about 50% of the economic activity taxes that go to the city. So basically the city is giving away other people's money, other jurisdictions' money, and only a portion of their own. And then of course there's something called a super TIF, which diverts even 100% of the money that would go to the city. And here is a visual way of explaining it. So like I said, you've got a piece of property here. It's maybe not performing optimally, and it's paying the base taxes. The developer in year one comes and says, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to develop the property. That will over time increase its assessed value, that green area, but I only want to really pay taxes on the base. And so the city chips in that green portion back to the developer, and then the story runs at the end of 23 years, they say, we'll all be laughing because the property will be so much more valuable, and the school districts and the libraries will get more money than they would have otherwise. And a big argument we hear when the proponents talk about TIF is, look, if we didn't do this, if we didn't introduce the TIF, this is all you'd be stuck with for the full 23 years, right? Nobody would touch this thing. And research around the country says that that may not be the case. And where does that money go? So in Kansas City and Jackson County, about 62% of property tax goes to schools. I think that's probably similar around Missouri. 20% goes to the city, and then you've got smaller amounts to the libraries and the county. Again, the mental health fund, for example. The Kansas City Star wrote a piece wringing its hands about the reduction in mental health services in the state of Kansas and how this was a horrible thing. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Star itself had asked for an extension of a property tax abatement that went to fund Missouri's mental health. So they get very excited about what's going on in Kansas. Meanwhile, they are part of the problem in Missouri. So how TIF is used? Well, we looked at both Kansas City and St. Louis, and this is Kansas City beneath the river, just the part beneath the river in Jackson County. And we broke the area into census tracts where there was poverty. 30% of the population was impoverished. So in the red areas, 30% or more are impoverished, and in the green areas, 30% or less are impoverished. So the green areas are wealthier, and we used Jackson County data to find out where the TIFs are. And the vast majority and the value of TIFs are right down here. Now that's Main Street coming down south on, that's downtown coming down south on Main Street. The collection of bubbles you see at the very, very top, that's undeveloped land now, but they want to build a high-rise luxury apartments. So I imagine as soon as those projects are completed, that area will turn green, but again, there's nothing there now. And what we noticed was that in large swaths of the city where there is poverty, where there is a lack of economic development, TIF doesn't take place. Part of that is because in Kansas City and in St. Louis, developers come to the city piecemeal and say, we've got a project, we've got a parcel, we'd like to apply for TIF. As opposed to what happens in some other states where the city kind of draws a circle around a part of town that is economically in decline and says, here's where we will subsidize development. The difference, of course, is that in one case, the city is driving the location. Here's the bad part of town. Here's where we want to attract investment. But in Kansas City and St. Louis, it's the developer that comes to the city with a project, so the city has even less control over where that money goes. We saw the same thing in St. Louis. So in the north part of the city, you have an awful lot of concentrated poverty, but you've got TIFs all along, Washington Avenue, that are where the money's being going. So we talked at the beginning about the idea of TIF would be to invest in economically declining areas, but the reality is we're developing in the economically attractive areas. So the subtitle of this presentation is A Tale of Three Cities. And in St. Louis and Kansas City, oftentimes, because the definition in Missouri of blight is so broad that developers can pretty much claim anything is blighted. Steve Potter, who's the head of the Mid-Continent Library out on the western part of the state, said that under state law, the governor's mansion could be blighted. It really is that vague. But in Joplin, after the tornado in 2011, clearly a large, significant portion of the city was blighted. This is a FEMA map, and you can see kind of the red line that was the total devastation of the tornado. But in late 2012, when the city council adopted the TIF area, and it was the largest in Missouri's history, 3,100 acres, they couldn't help themselves and kind of jogged up north. And can anybody just guess what that area might be up there? It's the downtown part of Joplin. So they saw, never let a crisis escape, never miss an opportunity to exploit a crisis. So that was the TIF district, and what they tried to do is define blight in such a way that you could clearly blight the areas that have been hit by the tornado and the areas that had been left in a bad state of repair downtown. So, for example, overgrowth of weeds and vegetation, illegally dumped refuse, lack of sidewalks, poorly maintained streetscapes. Those are the reasons why we pay taxes. Those are the things that are the city's responsibility to take care of. Yet those are the very reasons that they blighted parts of downtown. And so part of the frustrating aspect of TIF is oftentimes it rewards developers who have been sitting on a piece of land for a long time because they can go to the city and say, oh, look at the horrible condition of this piece of land. And the city never seems to say, well, you guys have owned it for 10 years, so maybe you should bear the responsibility of maintaining that. was particularly bad in Kansas City, an example we'll talk about in a little bit. So again, in Joplin, they drew a huge map of where they wanted to use TIF. What happened in Joplin, though, after the tornado is the developer that had been chosen by the city, Wallace Bialy, went away. The partners had a falling out. The company ceased to exist. The city had already issued, I think, about $18 million in bonds, and for the next number of years will be paying those bonds back with money that would otherwise be going to the school district and the library. But because they haven't had a developer, all the city has really done is just kind of buy and sell parcels. And Nicole Galloway, the state auditor from Missouri, kind of looked into their books and wrote a scathing report saying that the contracts the city had entered into failed to protect the city, that the RFP was clearly written in a way to award the project to one developer. And in fact, there was a member of the city council, sitting member of the city council, who acted as a broker in a lot of these real estate deals. And Nicole Galloway found that the city often paid too much and sold for too little. So again, the incentive to use taxpayers' money to enrich oneself was too great for some in Joplin. Another example of but-for in Joplin was a sports store came in and said, we're going to redevelop this area. And the TIF Commission said, well, we're going to help out. And the Sports Authority said, we don't want your help, we're not asking for your help, and yet the TIF Commission gave them help anyway. And that's actually important in the TIF process. Columbia is actually considering a TIF of the, is it the Broadway Hotel? The two aspects that are supposed to protect cities from kind of throwing money at anything is the Blight test and the but-for test. So the Blight test says, is this area actually, in economic decline? And like I said, the language is so broad that you could blight anything. And in Kansas City, we have pretty much blighted anything. But the other protection is the but-for test, which says that but for public investment, this project wouldn't take place. But here's an example of where the developer said publicly, in print, we don't need this money, yet the TIF Commission still adopted, I don't know, I should go back and look and see what their but-for claim was, because clearly the developer wasn't in on it. And again, so I was looking through the paperwork about what the TIF project is in Columbia, and the proponents of it have made very clear in the paper to say, look, there are guidelines, we have to make sure that public subsidy is necessary, the area has to be blighted, and a few other things. And those sound good until you realize that blight is meaningless in state statute. And that the but-for analysis is largely meaningless too. What happens is these cities, especially small towns, are lured into the TIF project by developers, and they may hire their own development attorney to look through the proposal, and the State Economic Development Corporation will help them, but that's just to make sure the application is legal. These applications are woefully forgive me, I've lost the word. They don't do a very good job of making sure that there actually is an economic need. The request may be legal and it may meet all the standards, but it still may be unnecessary. So the impact of TIF around, so here's some pictures from Kansas City. We've TIF'd a lot of things in Kansas City. So that is Country Club Plaza. That is the oldest outdoor shopping center in Kansas City, or forgive me, in the country. That is blighted. This is the River Market, which is kind of another shopping center in downtown Kansas City. That is blighted. Burns & McDonnell is one of the world's largest engineering firms. They went to the city council claiming that they could not afford to build on a lot next to their existing world headquarters on a piece of property that their development partners already owned. And the city council, of course, said, have at it. And so the taxpayers in Kansas City, by the way, in a district where 90% of our school children are on free or reduced lunch, the city of Kansas City subsidized the world headquarters for, I think, the 18th largest engineering firm in the world. And then this is our Power and Light district, where we spent and continue to spend millions of dollars every year because the city, in this particular agreement, agreed to cover the bond payments if the district underperformed. And would you be surprised to learn the district has underperformed, and Kansas City will be paying about $15 million out of the general fund until 2040, I think. And at the time, our mayor said, we're going to look like geniuses in 5 to 10 years. She said this in 2006. She's a wonderful woman. I don't think anybody would accuse her of being a genius. So again, over the past 16, 17 years, the city of St. Louis forewent just almost $800 million from TIF and abatement alone. In Kansas City, the total was nearly $60 million just in 2015. And again, as I said, in Joplin, a developer collapsed, so the bulk of rebuilding was done by private corporations. This is what's amazing about the TIF process in Joplin. And I think I'll go over this in the next slide. So the TIF process in Joplin, the tornado hits we're almost at the anniversary, May 22nd, 2011. It wipes out, I think, $34 million in assessed property, kills over 160 people, destroys, I think, destroys or damages 7,000 structures. And so, people start rebuilding immediately, and the developer comes along with this TIF idea and says to them at the end of 2012, hey, you guys have to sign this TIF agreement before the new year. And the reason why they wanted it signed in the new year is because the new property assessments would be coming in 2013. And the developer already knew that let me go back to this, that the property value would start climbing on its own. And as a result, they would capture less of that increase for their own. I think I have another visual of the, I've got to go through all this. Okay, so here we go. So the tornado hits here. The developers are very eager to have the city council adopt the TIF before the end of 2012 so that they can capture the increase we've seen in property values. And in fact, a lot of that captured revenue is going to support those TIFs. But one of the things the TIF project didn't account for in the country's largest tornado in decades, it didn't account for the $2.8 billion in insurance claims that would be and were used to rebuild Joplin. They simply said, we've got all this destruction, we need to subsidize development in order to build it. The developer went away, and so the school district in Joplin is losing out not only on this money, right, but before the tornado, a lot of that was money they should have anyway. So 6 years later, without the TIF, really, Joplin has recaptured all their lost assessed value. Their population now is larger than it was at the time of the tornado hit. They're fine, and they're fine largely because the city decided to get out of the way when it came to rebuilding, right? They relaxed some of their building codes and things like that. And it's because people invested privately, whether it was insurance claims or corporations coming in. I understand the Walgreens was built in they came in with the prefab exterior walls and just dropped them in place. And I encourage you now to go see what's going on in Joplin. It is remarkable to stand in some of those communities and realize that just a few years ago it was destroyed. But the fact is, the Joplin rebuild happened almost entirely because of individuals and corporations investing their own private capital, not because government came along and said, we're going to fix this for you. What's happening in Kansas City, and although these lines are on the same chart, don't use them to compare one against the other. So this is the assessed value, right? So we took the aggregate assessed value of the entire city of Kansas City and just plotted it over time. So you see the blue line, around 2007, 2008, we kind of peaked. We suffered the Great Recession, hit Kansas City a little bit later, and then we're slowly climbing. But starting around 2006, when that genius mayor of ours started assessing or started granting TIF to downtown to build H&R Block's world headquarters and the Sprint Center and the Power and Light District, we have started giving away more and more of that assessed value. So now we're just around just under 63%. So what's happening is, although property values in Kansas City are largely flat, we're getting less and less of it because we've adopted more and more TIF policies. And again, we have built, so taxpayers in Kansas City have built world headquarters for H&R Block, for Cerner, for J.E. Dunn for construction, for Burns and Mac. These are wealthy companies. Sometimes they're construction companies, yet they are able to go hat in hand to the city council in Kansas City and say, gosh, we just can't afford to do this. And because there are so few guardrails on the TIF process, it's all legal. So again, the long-term impact of TIF is that cities are hollowing out their tax base. Now, it's most notable in Kansas City and St. Louis. I think in Columbia, you only have 2 existing TIF projects, one that was adopted in 2009, another in 2011. What's happening in a lot of small towns around Missouri is that a developer may come in and say, we want to build a Walmart or some sort of shopping center, and they may not care too much where on this stretch of highway they build it. But there are 3 incorporated towns next to each other along that stretch of highway, and so these developers know they can come in and play the towns against each other, right? Think of The Simpsons. If you guys don't build the monorail, we're just going to go to Shelbyville. And that's exactly what happens in Missouri. These cities are afraid, these towns, they're afraid of kind of a drying up of all the kids moving out, and so they're desperate for any kind of development. And oftentimes, developers can play on those fears. One of the things I try to make clear to city councils when I go and talk to them is the premise of TIF is basically this. A developer comes to you and says, I have got a really bad business idea. I mean, this is a bad idea. But, taxpayer, if you will be the investor of first resort, if you will put the money up first, well, then you can make this into a great business deal, and we'll make all sorts of money. Now, you look at the Power and Light District, it didn't bear out, but in Kansas City now, and in St. Louis as well, we have, in Kansas City, it's Hyatt. Hyatt wants to build a convention hotel downtown, but Hyatt doesn't want to spend any of Hyatt's money. So Hyatt wants the taxpayers of Kansas City to build a hotel for them. And I think you don't need to be a business major to understand if it isn't a good deal for Hyatt to spend their own money on this, why is it a good deal for taxpayers? And oftentimes it's because the incentive for politicians to go to a ribbon cutting is so great. Look what we built, right? In Kansas City, that's what we hear all the time. Look at downtown, look how wonderful it is. We built this. The fact that population is flat, jobs are flat, and that we spent far too much for what we built doesn't seem to register. If I were king, a law I would love to adopt in Missouri and around the country is for every ribbon cutting a politician goes to, they must also go to one padlocking. And I think their desire to go and show you what was built and what was new would be dampened if they had to go and lock up businesses that had failed. But again, the incentive is spend, 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 build, have your photo up. I talked about Kansas City, what we've subsidized there. Throughout Missouri, certainly in Kansas City, the Economic Development Corporation that works with TIF applicants to make sure that their application passes muster is funded by the fees that developers pay through the TIF. So you have a conflict of interest. Their Christmas party, their salaries, their bonuses, their number of employees are determined by how many projects get approved. So what the proponents of tax increment financing will say, and we talked a little bit about this, is, hey, look, that's free money. The Burns and Mac headquarters that we saw a picture of a minute ago was built on land that had been owned by Shalom Temple, a synagogue that had closed down. The population, the congregation had moved into Kansas. So it was just sitting there doing nothing. We're not collecting any tax revenue on it, so why don't we develop it? See the value increase, and at the end of 23 years, the city, the school district, everybody will be so much better off. Mayor James in Kansas City says there's no bank where you walk into and says school money and you take it out and give it to developers. And he's absolutely right, but what the studies show, and these are studies out of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Bill Lester there studied TIF in Chicago. The St. Louis Development Corporation did a study of TIF in St. Louis. and largely found that first, these projects would happen anyway. If it is a good project for Burns and McDonnell to build its world headquarters adjacent to its existing world headquarters, they will do it, whether the city incentivizes them or not. But what they know in Missouri is that you can go to the city and say, we won't do it unless you give us money, and cities just fall for it. They desperately want to build something and to point to it. So again, that's the studies I talked about. There's a new study by the Upjohn Institute for, I think, Employment Research, which just used an awful lot of data and again said the same thing. These TIF projects do not spur investment in the community, do not create as many jobs as are promised, and generally subsidize things that probably would have happened anyway. You know, my response to the mayor, I was talking to a reporter the other day, and I said, you know, it's as if you went up to somebody, the mayor's argument that it's not taking money from schools, is as if somebody went up to you and said, hey, I'm going to freeze your salary for 23 years, but I'm not taking any money. And she said, well, that actually sounds like my journalism career. But if you're not a reporter, that is a harrowing thing to hear, especially then to have at the end, but I'm not taking any money from you. So again, this is Steve Rose, a columnist in Kansas City, who said on television, I don't care what the research tells you. He sees nice, new, shiny buildings, and he wants to pay for them. He thinks it works. He then went on to characterize Chapel Hill's research as libertarian garbage, so he hadn't even read the study that he was criticizing. But again, he doesn't care. And so I talked a little bit about this. UNC Chapel Hill, St. Louis Development Corporation. Again, that is the economic development corporation of St. Louis, did their own study and found that basically their own reason for existence isn't generating any benefit. And so again, they come with these promises. If you look at this Missouri Department of Revenue's annual report on TIF, you will find, it's 1,000 pages, you will find that generally developers in the aggregate only deliver about 1/3 of the jobs they promise. And even those numbers are self-reported. I asked the Department of Revenue, how do you audit these numbers? How do you know what these jobs are? And they don't. They don't even claim to vet them. They just say, this is what the business gives us. What happened in Kansas City is H&R Block says, build us a new headquarters and we'll create 2,600 jobs. What they did was just move, it's now 1,700 jobs, but they just moved all their employees from other sites to that building. They didn't create any jobs. They just relocated them from other parts of the city. So again, I talked about the two findings, the Blight finding and the but-for test. Both of them sound good, but in reality, they are so broad and so meaningless that anything can be applicable to TIF. And according to the Pitch, which is kind of our broadsheet tabloid paper in Kansas City, the TIF process is dominated by developers and their attorneys who dominate campaign contributions. We talked about Blight, the problem with Blight. Steve Belke, who looked at that Burns and Mack piece of land that was the abandoned synagogue, he said, this is the worst case of vandalism I've ever seen. But the building was going to be bulldozed. So why is it important if the building was in good condition or bad? You know, I said to him, to the degree that people stripped out the copper pipes, they actually helped you tear it down. And the fact is, for several years, the piece of land that the synagogue sat on was owned by one of the development partners. So again, they're complaining about vandalism because they didn't secure the lot themselves. And this is great. David Stokes, my colleague, and I have been unable to find in any case in the entire state of Missouri an example where a developer hired people and they came back and said, no, this isn't blighted, or no, this doesn't pass the but-for. It just doesn't happen. So here are some possible reforms. And I think based on some of the calls that Show Me Institute has gotten from legislators and some of the legislation already introduced this past session, I am optimistic that TIF could be the subject of some reform. Within a city, limit TIF to an annual dollar amount. Just simply say this is all you can abate or subsidize for the year. Or cap it at a percentage of the city's total value. I think right now in Kansas City, we have abated about 14% of our total land value. That seems high to me, or higher than it should be. In Kansas, we could give schools and other taxing jurisdictions a veto or to walk away with their money. I think that's what happens in Kansas. We could say, if you're going to look at blight at this particular parcel, why don't you examine the parcels around it? That Beth Shalom Temple would have never been considered eligible for TIF if they had simply looked at the very nice neighborhood that sat around it. Use actual research for the but-for determination. Oftentimes, the but-for determination is supported by an affidavit from the developer who just says, yeah, I need this money. It's a one-page piece of evidence. And that's just a crazy incentive. Or maybe just shorter periods of time. Instead of 23 years, maybe 10 years. When I go and talk to libraries and school districts, they aren't necessarily against TIF. They understand that there could be some potential improvement over years, but they have a real problem with the amount of tax that is taken from them and the length of time that is taken from them. Imagine you're a school district, your job is to educate children. A developer wants to build a housing complex in your district and ask for TIF. Not only is that robbing you of money, but it's increasing the number of families that may be moving into your district. So your costs go up, but your revenue will stay flat. So those are some opportunities. I'm happy to take questions on anything. I know we talked about a great deal, but thank you for your attention. And let me know if I can answer any questions. Yes, sir. So Brandon Ellington is a representative from the Kansas City area, and he said his legislation was to require a county-wide vote on any TIF, which frankly would be a poison pill. Show Me Institute offered testimony. We didn't talk too much about that particular thing, but we did talk about almost any reform would be better than the status quo. I think what's happening, I think what the research tells us is that because we give TIF to anyone, the data is garbage, and so it shows no benefit. I am an optimist, naive sometimes, but I think you might be able to go into parts of Kansas City and parts of St. Louis and say, this area here used to be stores, there are a number of people who live here. We can work with a developer who wants to build here. And then subsidize that, rather than say, we're open for business and everybody wants subsidies in the nice parts of town. So I'm not willing to throw the whole thing out, but I realize I may just be naive. Something else I want to pursue the remainder of this year is a developer. When I gave this presentation in St. Louis, a developer said and reminded me of something that the head of the Economic Development Corporation said in Kansas City, which is, we need these subsidies because our cities adopt such crazy building regulations that it becomes more and more expensive to build. And so the TIF allows us to pay for that additional burden, rather than just let's reduce the burden. So an answer to TIF reform might be, we will, if you come to us and ask for help, maybe rather than just give you cash, we'll reduce the regulations that you've got to deal with, or maybe wipe them out entirely. Is it Pulte Home Builders just pulled out of Missouri because the regulations in the state have become so big? Joe Forshaw said it was one of his biggest clients, and they're done in the state. So I think what's happening is we're using TIF to cover up some of the more expensive regulations. Yes, sir. Gosh, I haven't thought of that. I suspect that TIF is more popular in urban areas because they are older cities, older infrastructure, and over the past 50 years, populations have just been moving out of cities into suburbs, right? So, but they TIF in suburbs too. So I don't know. I don't know where. My guess would be that it happens more in urban areas. But you know, Overland Park, just across state line in Kansas, throws money at developers all day long too.
Well, I mean, it would just.
I don't know. I think sometimes in small towns the city council just gets rolled because the developer comes in there, makes the flashy promises, and the council just doesn't have the experience or the resources to fight back, right? They hear all the promises, they want to do something. But I suspect that there is probably a relationship between TIF use, urban areas, and urban areas tend to vote Democratic. When I first moved to Kansas City, I was talking to a former city councilman, and I moved to Kansas City from Washington, D.C., and I said, Bob, I don't want to be the jerk who moves here from Kansas City and from Washington, D.C. and says, what the hell is wrong with your government? But what the hell is wrong with your government? And he said, and you probably see this in St. Louis, and certainly in Kansas City, he said, look, anybody in Kansas City who cares about small government, good schools, and running a business has already left. So all that's left in Kansas City are the suckers like me who like old homes. Everybody else who wants to create wealth has probably already left. And so again, what you're left with in the city are people who are probably left of center, right? Social justice warriors who want to stick it to the wealthy. The irony, of course, is they're not. They're handing cash, hand over fist, to these developers to build. So I don't have an exact answer to your question. Well, yes. It is very frustrating to go through and confirm some of these claims years later, right? Or we're going to give you this many jobs. To find out that H&R Block only had like 1,700 employees, but they promised to add 2,600 when they got their downtown. I happened to find an article on their interior design company's page, which said, here are the number of people we moved in. The city, like I said, the state and the city don't even audit any of these numbers, which makes me laugh because not only do they underperform, right? Do they create only about a third of the jobs they said they would, but they get to make those numbers up. And even in their imagination, they can't get to 100%. So there are some, I forget the organization, but the cities will now be required, the GASB standards, cities will now be required to list abatement and TIF as actual part of subsidies and track the dollar amount and have to report that. So that will start probably this year. You're absolutely right, different jurisdictions track differently and to different degrees. Jackson County, Missouri actually does an excellent job of tracking all this stuff. St. Louis City, it's a different animal. I don't want to say that they don't do a good job, but they do a different job, and it doesn't necessarily allow us to compare St. Louis City or St. Louis County with Jackson County. It would be great if there were some standard, or even if the Missouri Department of Revenue kind of took that over, because there's an awful lot of money we're spending, and we really don't even know what success looks like. We haven't even agreed on that. Yeah, I agree. And part of it too is, we've got so many different so many different types of taxes. So community improvement districts, CIDs, transportation development districts, on top of regular state tax or state and city sales taxes and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of them, and they can sneak away. They stack, of course. The Burger King at near my house in Waldo, Kansas City, I think is around 12.5% sales tax when all is said and done. That's quite a whopper. But I would agree with you. I'd like the government to have more ability to look into it. I'd like the public to have more ability to look into it. But I think the incentive now is to stay out of the news for government officials. Yes, sir. It is, again, I vacillate between being a cynic and being naive. and sometimes both at the same time. The 2 or 3 developers in Kansas City spend an awful lot of money on political contributions. They have the ear of the politicians in Kansas City, yet they will even go on our public radio station and say, yeah, TIF is really getting out of hand, when the guys who profit from it are embarrassed by the amount of it. That's noteworthy, but there they are, and they're making contributions, and politicians who campaign being against this sort of thing are suddenly for it. It would be nice to know, even if a city like Columbia had some kind of unified vision of where are we going, where do we think our opportunities for growth are, something like that would inform both apartment building and subsidies and all sorts of policy. But a lot of times councils come and go and the members just kind of wing it. And anything that shows up on your watch and says, we're going to build a Ferris wheel and we're going to put your name on it, it's tough to say no to that. And it's going to be free. Crosby Kemper, who is the chairman of the board of the Show Me Institute, runs the library system in Kansas City. And everybody knows where he stands on this. And he will go to city council meetings and say, this is ridiculous. Oftentimes, libraries and school districts haven't really figured out the cost. They kind of get an idea, this TIF, that TIF, but they haven't really figured out the cost. In Jackson County, last year, we raised the levy of the Mid-Continent Library, and it was really a TIF tax because their budget has largely been frozen, I think, since 1985, and they can't grow because the city keeps, kind of reaching into their pocket and taking out the property tax. The other problem in Missouri, which I think is ripe for reform, is TIF councils are generally 11 members. The mayor appoints 6. So it really doesn't matter who else is on the board, right? But the school district will have a vote, the library might have a vote, mental health fund might have a vote, but the mayor is appointing 6 of them, and when I worked for a congressman, he would say 218 votes beats the best idea in the House. So no matter how good your idea, if you don't have those 6 votes. And in Kansas City, what happened was one of the mayor's appointees voted actually to delay consideration of a TIF, and he was removed from the council. So a TIF that was proposed in downtown Kansas City and was to be funded, the developer was the Hellsberg family of the jewelry. They wanted subsidies to build a building in a nice part of town, and it was school parents who led the effort to stop it. So I think the school district has a great deal of political capital they can use in these cases. They choose not to. But I think parents can be motivated when they realize the amount of money that's being diverted away from schools, again, especially in Kansas City and St. Louis. But I think a lot of these taxing jurisdictions aren't aware, or maybe there's just political pressure to shut up and play nice. I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. I believe there are 13 different definitions of blight in Missouri statute, and they are triggered very different ways, right? Or they mean very different things depending on, what statute you're referring to. So for example, in Lee's Summit a few years ago, the city wanted to blight a whole part of town and use institute an economic enterprise zone. So Show Me went to testify and point out how this was a bad idea, and they actually didn't do it. But I think what really discouraged them is 250 people who showed up saying, you're going to blight my house, I fear eminent domain. 2 completely different uses of blight. The council tried to explain that, no, this blight is not that blight, but the people hear blight, and we all have an idea of what blight means. Anybody can show me in town a blighted neighborhood, but that's not the legal definition. So I think it would be good for probably politicians themselves to kind of adopt some, unified theory of blight and have one definition and then try to police it that way. But again, that's getting into statute and insisting on definitions is a mess. Yes, sir. You can claim it's unethical, but no, to your point, so here's what happened in Kansas City. The Intercontinental Hotel, which is a luxury hotel right on Country Club Plaza, said, oh, we need to institute a community improvement district, a 1% sales tax, so that we can redo our garage and some of the interior of the hotel. And the people were outraged. You're not using this for improvements around the area, you're replacing carpet. These are things that you should be using your own, profit for. But when the Intercontinental asked for it, every other hotel went and got their own CID or applied for their own CID for the exact same thing. I think it absolutely is a subsidy that affects other businesses. If these guys aren't having to pay the full cost of developing because the city's gotten in bed with them, it absolutely impacts businesses around them. Why those businesses don't stand up and cry out against it, I don't know. In Kansas City, I suspect it's because if you're big enough, you probably think you're in line for your own TIF. And if you're too small, you're busy running your day-to-day business. I think what strikes people as unfair in Kansas City and St. Louis is all the small and mid-level businesses who know that none of these subsidies are available to them. In fact, they're going to have to pay more taxes to make up for the subsidies, and they're going to have to compete against these subsidized businesses. But again, it's one of these things, and frankly, I think part of it is, in the last 2 or 3 years, people have been hearing more about TIF. Walter Johnson is a professor of history and African-American history at Harvard, and he came to Kansas City Library on February 1st to talk about TIF in Ferguson. You have Emerson Electric, which I want to say is a $24 billion company, pays almost no property tax because of TIF and abatement deals with Ferguson. He got so many questions afterwards specific to TIF. He said, normally when I go out and talk about TIF, nobody knows what I'm talking about. But in Kansas City, we've heard so much about it, and I think we've abused it so much that people are starting to get aware of it. And I'm optimistic that next year we can get some hearings on some reform and bring those businesses out whose competition is being subsidized, or bring those businesses out who think that they're being treated unfairly. But again, it's kind of the process we're in. But I am amazed that more businesses, more school parents, more school districts and libraries aren't up in arms over this. Any other questions? Yes, sir. It was an eye-opener for me when I was attending that Lee's Summit, those Lee's Summit meetings about economic enterprise zones, because everybody was on the same side of the table, right? So the city council had hired an economic development consultant. The economic development folks from the state were there. Of course, they, I'm sure to some degree, measure their success by the number of development deals around the state. They come in and say, everybody's doing it, so you should do it too. And nobody, except for the Show Me Institute, showed up to say, none of these work. We've done studies of these agreements around Missouri, and they don't make a difference. But yes, the EDC in Kansas City and probably St. Louis and everywhere else around the state is funded by TIF fees. They have the state development guys come in and help them. When they get an application for a TIF process, the EDC works with the developer to make sure they're in compliance. So they're already on your side. And then they make an agreement. And by the way, EDCs are nonprofit organizations. They're not government agencies. They're 501c4s, which means they can lobby. And that's exactly what they do. You go meet with them, they clean up your application, they lobby the city council saying you ought to do this, and then they reap the reward because your fees enrich them. So it is exactly that. It's a conflict of interest, and there seems to be nobody at the table who's looking out for the taxpayer.
Please join me.
Thank you.